Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking on something absolutely massive, a complete scientific teardown and rebuild of how we treat mental health. We're going to unpack the groundbreaking framework proposed by Dr. Abraham Peled, who makes an incredibly compelling case that we just need to start over in psychiatry. If you've ever had that nagging feeling that psychiatric diagnoses act more like arbitrary labels than actual helpful explanations, well, we're going to show you exactly why that is. And more importantly, we'll look at how we can actually fix it. Let's just jump right in and confront a pretty shocking possibility right out of the gate. What if the entire foundation of modern psychiatric diagnosis, literally the way we define what it means to be mentally ill, is built on a 200-year-old category error? To grasp how serious this really is, we got to look back at a huge moment in 2013. The head of the National Institute of Mental Health at the time, Friston Insel, dropped a bombshell. He flat out stated that the NIMH was going to effectively abandon the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is pretty much considered the Bible of psychiatry. Why? Because, as Insel pointed out, the manual lacks true scientific validity. Sure, it might be reliable, meaning two doctors can look at a checklist and agree on a label, but it achieves that reliability by completely ignoring validity. It doesn't actually map to what's physically happening inside the biology of the brain. Which brings us to part one, psychiatry's fatal category error. Imagine you go to the doctor feeling awful, and instead of finding a bacterial infection, they just diagnose you with high temperature disorder. It sounds ridiculous, right? But honestly, that's essentially what psychiatry has been doing for decades. The DSM relies on symptom checklists, which is exactly like classifying a fever. It completely fails to investigate the underlying biological mechanisms, which is the actual infection causing that fever. It's obsessively classifying the surface while entirely ignoring the source. So how did we end up here? Well, this category error started way back with Penel's 18th century asylum reforms, which organized illness entirely around observable behavior. Then, in the 19th century, Kraepelin created a masterful taxonomy, but here's the kicker: it was only ever meant to be a temporary placeholder until neuroscience caught up. But the neuroscience never arrived on the DSM's terms. The ultimate proof of this failure? Just look at the 1973 APA vote. A committee literally voted to remove homosexuality from the DSM. Just think about that for a second. Diseases defined by a show of hands cannot be real biological diseases. By the time the NIMH walked away in 2013, the data had long shown the whole system was crumbling. So we absolutely need a massive paradigm shift here. We have to move away from the old way, phenomenological checklists, just observing outward behaviors and taking committee votes, and move to a new way, a way that is anchored strictly in biological mechanisms and actual neuroscience. We need to be looking at real brain circuit configurations. All right, let's move into part two, the brain as a prediction machine. Now, the real alternative to the DSM doesn't actually start in a psychiatry clinic. It starts in the mathematics of computer science. Computer scientists and neural network engineers actually gave us the first real computable models for how thought disorders physically happen. Take hot field networks, for example. They showed us that our memories don't just live in one isolated spot, but across distributed networks, and they fail in very characteristic, predictable ways. Meanwhile, Hinton's work on backpropagation revealed how our brains build complex representations layer by layer. Researchers like Hoffman at Yale and Peled and Jeva and Beersheva took these exact insights and applied them to model conditions like schizophrenia. They mathematically proved that we can actually map the mind's failures. And all of this really comes together with Carl Friston's free energy principle and predictive coding. Friston argues that your brain is basically a prediction machine, constantly trying to minimize surprise in the world. Because of that, we have to start viewing mental illness not as a behavioral problem or some kind of character flaw, but as a neural computation error. It's a prediction failure. Essentially, the brain's software is crashing. The absolute most crucial takeaway here is that 4 decades of diverse neuroscience literally converge on one single undeniable truth. From Mesulam's maps of the cortex to Tononi's integrated information theory, right down to complex mathematical models representing our sense of self, they all point to the same thing. The brain's dynamic network organization is the true substrate of the mind, and it is the exact site of mental disorder. This leads us perfectly into part 3, clinical brain profiling explained. Enter clinical brain profiling, or CBP for short. This is a total game changer. It's a comprehensive framework of neuroanalysis. Instead of asking what arbitrary cluster of symptoms you happen to have, CBP asks what's actually happening in your corticostratothalamocortical, or CSTC network.
That's the major loop connecting your deep brain to your outer cortex. It translates these complex brain circuits directly into clinical practice, completely bypassing those outdated traditional diagnoses.
Now, this is where it gets really fascinating. Under CBP, every single mental process elegantly maps onto 4 distinct timescales of brain plasticity. Let's break that down. In milliseconds, you've got cognizance plasticity, driven by fast gamma oscillations. Move out to minutes or hours, and you have reactive plasticity. That's your basic neurotransmission and working memory. Over days to weeks, adaptive plasticity kicks in, which involves synaptic remodeling and long-term responses, like how you'd respond to an antidepressant. And finally, over a lifetime, developmental plasticity shapes your brain's architecture through epigenetics and broad connectivity. When something goes wrong in the mind, it is going wrong at one of these highly specific biological intersections.
So, under this new CBP framework, those hundreds of arbitrary, confusing DSM categories, they just dissolve. Gone. Instead, they are replaced by just 6 specific, transdiagnostic entities: psychosis, negative signs, anxiety, depression, mania, and personality disorder patterns. But here is the massive difference. These are not symptom clusters. Each one of these is a distinct, measurable circuit configuration in the brain. We are finally actually diagnosing the infection, not just checking off the fever.
Which brings us to part 4, matching tools to circuits. Now we shift from diagnosing the problem to actually fixing it. And this brings us to the ultimate governing question of CBP. We officially get to throw out the outdated guesswork of what drug fits this diagnosis and replace it with a precise biological question. What tool fits this specific circuit at this specific timescale? And the amazing part? We literally have the tools to answer that right now. We're looking at a precision neuromodulation arsenal. We can use ECT for a broad plasticity reset when a system desperately needs a reboot. We can use targeted magnetic stimulation on specific outer folds of the brain, like hitting the left DLPFC for depression or the left TPJ for auditory hallucinations. We've got tools to safely modulate entire network states, focused ultrasound for deep brain targeting without ever needing surgery, and even psychedelic-assisted therapies designed specifically for structural ego dissolution. Every single tool in this modern atlas maps perfectly onto a specific timescale and a specific brain circuit. This whole framework also radically changes how we view the medications we already use today. Take traditional antipsychotics, for example, which rely heavily on blocking dopamine receptors. Under CBP, we clearly see that this blockade is actually a massive amplifier for negative signs like apathy or emotional withdrawal. Because of this, finding the absolute minimum effective dose isn't just a nice best practice anymore. It's a strict biological imperative to protect the patient's brain circuit and ensure we aren't actively making their negative symptoms worse. Let's wrap things up with part 5, the future of mental health. The absolute most important takeaway from Dr. Pellet's work is that this isn't just a bunch of complaints waiting for a magical future solution. This is the solution. The DSM was never the map. It was just the absence of a map. Neuroanalysis finally gives us that map. And CBP doesn't ask psychiatry to sit around and wait for the science to be 100% perfect. It demands that we use the imperfect, but highly real, mechanistic science that is fully available to us right now, today. And really, it all comes down to this incredibly powerful, humanizing goal. We have to anchor clinical practice in the brain's actual physical mechanisms rather than surface behaviors. Why? So we can finally offer the patient sitting across the desk not a label, but a true explanation. Just imagine the profound dignity we could restore to a patient by telling them exactly how their neural network is misfiring instead of just handing them a stigmatizing label that a committee voted on. So, I want to leave you with a pretty provocative thought. The science is already here. The advanced tools like targeted magnetic stimulation, focused ultrasound, and cognitive remediation are ready, or they're rapidly becoming ready. The only thing standing in the way is this. Will psychiatry actually find the institutional will to finally abandon the symptom checklist and fully embrace the circuit? The stakes for the future of mental health care literally couldn't be higher. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this leaves you eager to dive into the fascinating world of neuroscience even further.